He looked me dead in the eye, smirked, and said, "Rules are rules." He had no idea those 3 words would cost him his house, his reputation, and $50,000. My name is Daniel Ruiz, and this is the story of how I spent 2 years quietly, legally, and completely destroying the man who thought a homeowners association was his personal kingdom. If you've ever been humiliated by someone drunk on a little bit of power, a boss, a landlord, a petty little tyrant with a clipboard, stick around, because what happens to this man is one of the most satisfying downfalls you'll hear all year. Hit like, subscribe, and let's get into it. It all started with something as small and stupid as the color of a fence. My name is Daniel Ruiz. I'm 34 years old, an operations analyst by trade, which basically means I spend my days finding patterns in messy data and figuring out where things don't add up. I mention that because that skill is going to matter a lot later in this story. Back then, though, I was just a regular guy looking for a regular life. I wanted a quiet street, a decent-sized yard, neighbors who minded their own business. That's what the real estate listing promised. A friendly, well-maintained community, perfect for families. What that listing conveniently left out was a man named Todd Whitfield. Todd was the president of our homeowners association, self-appointed king of a 6-block kingdom of beige houses and manicured lawns. He was the kind of man who introduced himself by his title before his own name. "Hi, I'm Todd, HOA president," he said, gripping my hand a little too firmly on the day I moved in, his eyes already drifting past me to scan the moving truck parked slightly over the property line. I remember thinking, this guy takes himself way too seriously. I laughed it off, told myself every neighborhood has one guy like this. Harmless, a little uptight, somebody to roll your eyes about at the mailbox. I believed that for exactly 6 weeks. Then came the letter. See, I'd repainted my fence using what I was told was the HOA-approved stain color. Except that exact shade wasn't in stock anywhere within 60 miles of us. I called 4 hardware stores to check. So I used the closest match available and kept every single receipt, every paint chip, every email chain, showing I had genuinely tried to follow the rules. I figured that would be more than enough if anyone ever questioned it. Todd fined me $500. I remember standing in my kitchen holding that letter, feeling the specific kind of heat crawl up the back of my neck. The kind you get when you're being punished for something that genuinely wasn't your fault, when you did everything right, and it still doesn't matter. I gathered up my folder of proof and drove to the next HOA meeting actually believing, naively, that reasonable people just needed reasonable evidence, that if I just explained myself clearly enough, this would get sorted out in 5 minutes. Todd barely glanced at what I handed him. He gave this little smirk, the exact smirk I would replay in my head for the next 2 years of my life, and said, "Rules are rules." Then he turned and walked away like the conversation had never happened at all, like I hadn't even spoken. And here's the thing. In that moment, something shifted in me. It wasn't rage exactly. It wasn't the kind of anger that makes you raise your voice or slam a door. It was something colder than that, quieter. I remember driving home that night in complete silence, no radio, just turning that smirk over and over in my mind. And somewhere on that drive I made a decision. I wasn't going to yell at this man. I wasn't going to make a scene in a parking lot or leave an angry voicemail he could dismiss as me overreacting. I was going to get organized. I was going to be patient. And I was going to take my time. Here's the thing about men like Todd. They mistake silence for surrender. They see someone go quiet after a confrontation and assume they've won, assume the other person has simply given up and gone back to their life. So that's exactly what I gave him. Silence. Compliance. The appearance of a guy who'd learned his lesson. A few months later, a seat opened up on the HOA board. I volunteered, told everyone, including Todd, that I just wanted to get more involved in the community, give back a little. Todd practically welcomed me in with open arms. Why wouldn't he? To him, I was just another warm body who'd nod along in meetings and rubber stamp whatever he wanted. For the next 2 years, I showed up to every single meeting without fail. Rain or shine, tired from work or not, I was there. I took notes nobody asked me to take. I sat quietly in the back corner of that stuffy community room and just watched. And the longer I watched, the more I started to understand exactly how Todd operated. He scheduled important votes on nights he already knew his loudest critics would be out of town, birthdays, vacations, work trips. He somehow always knew. He'd bury dissent in paperwork, handing out forms and procedural requirements designed less to inform people and more to exhaust them into giving up. And paperwork submitted by homeowners who disagreed with him had this strange habit of getting lost somewhere between the mailbox and the filing cabinet. I watched this pattern repeat itself meeting after meeting, month after month, and I kept my mouth shut and my pen moving. But it wasn't until about a year in that I noticed something bigger than fence colors and lost paperwork, something that made my stomach turn in a completely different way. Our HOA fees were noticeably higher than 3 comparable neighborhoods just a few minutes away. I know because I actually called and asked their management companies directly, pretending to be a prospective buyer. Meanwhile, our community pool was closed for maintenance for nearly half of every single summer. The landscaping in our common areas looked like nobody had touched it in months, overgrown, patchy, dying in places. None of it lined up. We were paying more and getting less, and Todd, who controlled every financial document in his role as treasurer, absolutely hated being asked why. I brought it up once, casually, almost offhandedly, during a meeting. Just asked if we could all see the annual budget breakdown. Todd laughed it off immediately. "Don't worry about it. I've got under control," he said, already moving on to the next agenda item before I could even respond. That answer sat with me for days afterward, not because it sounded suspicious on the surface. It's the kind of thing anyone might say, but because of how fast he brushed it aside. Like the question itself was an inconvenience he didn't want to entertain for even 5 seconds. People with nothing to hide don't usually flinch that quickly. So I did what any reasonable board member is entitled to do. I filed a formal, written request for the financial records. Under our own HOA bylaws, he was required to provide them within a set number of days. Those days came and went, then weeks. Nothing. Instead of pushing harder through official channels right away, I started doing something different. I started talking to my neighbors. Not in some big dramatic confrontation, just casual conversations over fences, in driveways, at the mailbox. And it turned out I wasn't remotely the only one who'd asked these questions before. Over a dozen homeowners, some of whom had lived there far longer than me, told me they'd requested the same financial records at various points over the years, and every single one of them had been ignored, stalled, or brushed off exactly the way I had. One neighbor, an older woman named Carol who'd lived on the street for almost a decade, told me she was fairly certain she'd seen a brand new patio go up at Todd's own house right around the same time the HOA had paid out a mysterious $15,000 landscaping fee. Another neighbor swore up and down that she'd personally seen Todd's kids swimming in our community pool during one of its supposed maintenance closures, splashing around while the rest of us were told it was unsafe to use. Piece by piece, conversation by conversation, a pattern was forming. And it wasn't a pattern of incompetence. It was starting to look a lot more like a pattern of theft. Armed with all of these second-hand accounts, I filed a formal complaint with the rest of the board, demanding Todd finally comply with the original records request. He stalled for as long as he possibly could, dragging his feet, making excuses about his schedule, about needing to consolidate the paperwork properly first. But with multiple board members now aware of the complaint, he eventually ran out of room to maneuver. When he finally did hand over the financial documents, it was an absolute mess, and not the kind of mess that comes from simple disorganization. Invoices were missing entirely. Payments were mislabeled in ways that made no logical sense. There was a $15,000 landscaping fee paid out to a company that, when I actually tried to look it up, didn't seem to exist anywhere. No website, no business registration I could find, nothing. There were thousands more dollars filed under vague headers like administrative costs, with zero explanation or supporting documentation attached to any of it. I spent entire weekends at my kitchen table cross-referencing HOA bank statements against publicly available property records, contractor licensing databases, anything I could get my hands on legally. I remember the exact moment everything clicked into place. It was close to 11 at night, my laptop screen glowing in an otherwise dark kitchen, coffee gone cold beside me, when I found 2 numbers that should never, under any normal circumstance, have matched each other, and they matched perfectly. Money that had left the HOA's account was traceable, through a chain of transactions, right back into what appeared to be Todd's own personal finances. My hands were actually shaking a little as I sat there. Not from fear, from this strange mixture of vindication and disbelief. He wasn't just a petty bully who enjoyed fining people over fence colors. He was stealing from every single family on that street, month after month, year after year, while lecturing all of us about rules the entire time. I kept digging after that, and it only got worse. I found evidence that Todd had been quietly inflating invoices from a contractor who handled most of the HOA's maintenance work, a buddy of his, and that the inflated difference was being kicked back to Todd personally. A quiet little arrangement that, based on the dates I could find, had apparently been running for years, well before I'd even moved into the neighborhood that I built everything into one comprehensive report. Spreadsheets laying out every discrepancy line by line. Photos of the neglected common areas next to the invoices, claiming they'd been professionally maintained. Notarized written statements from neighbors who were willing to put their names behind what they'd personally witnessed. I laid it all out methodically, carefully, the way a prosecutor builds a case they intend to win, because that's exactly what I was doing. Then I waited for the right moment. Our annual HOA meeting was usually a dead, sleepy affair. Maybe 5 or 6 people scattered across folding chairs in a stuffy community room, most of them there just to complain about parking. Not this time. In the weeks leading up to it, I quietly went door to door around the neighborhood. I didn't tell people everything I'd found. I didn't want to tip my hand too early or give Todd any warning to start covering his tracks further. I just told people enough about missing records, about questions that weren't being answered, to make them curious, to make them want to actually show up this time. And they did. The night of that meeting, the room was completely packed. Every folding chair filled, people standing shoulder to shoulder along the back wall. I remember scanning the room and feeling this strange calm settle over me. The kind of calm that comes after months of preparation finally being about to pay off. Todd started the meeting exactly the way he always did, droning on about how hard he worked for this community, how much personal sacrifice went into being HOA president, thanking everyone for their patience with the pool closures and the fee increases. I let him finish his whole speech. I didn't interrupt. I wanted him fully relaxed, fully in his element, before I stood up. "Todd," I said, keeping my voice level and calm, "can you walk us through a few discrepancies in the annual budget?" He laughed it off, the same way he always did with any question he didn't want to answer. I don't think this is the time or place for that conversation. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just said, "Actually, Todd, it's the perfect time." Then I stood up, walked to the front, and handed out copies of the full report to every single person sitting in that room. I watched the shift happen in real time, and I have to tell you, it was one of the most satisfying things I have ever witnessed. People started flipping through the pages, eyebrows shooting up, quiet whispers between neighbors turning into open, pointed questions directed straight at Todd. Those questions turning into raised voices. Todd tried to talk over the noise, tried to regain control of the room the way he always had before. But it was too late for that. Nobody was listening to him anymore. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one in control of that room. We called for an emergency vote to remove him as HOA president that same night, right there on the spot. The vote passed overwhelmingly. Todd Whitfield, self-appointed king of our 6-block kingdom, was out. But that meeting was really just the beginning of the end for him, not the end itself. In the weeks that followed, we brought in an independent, licensed auditor to go through every single financial record from Todd's entire time as treasurer. The audit confirmed everything I'd found and then some. Over $50,000 in outright embezzled funds, tens of thousands more in funds that were simply mismanaged or unaccounted for, and multiple documented instances of financial fraud. We reported everything to local law enforcement. We filed a civil lawsuit as a community to recover as much of the stolen money as legally possible. Todd's contractor buddy got dragged into the fallout right alongside him and ended up formally banned from doing any further business within the county after his own role in the scheme came to light. In the end, Todd had to sell his house just to cover the restitution payments and mounting legal fees. His name became something of a running joke around the neighborhood after that. The guy who spent years acting like he ran the place, only to end up running from it entirely. We didn't stop at just removing him, either. We used the momentum from that meeting to completely rebuild how our HOA operated from the ground up. We implemented strict term limits so no single person could ever entrench themselves in power like that again. We required multiple board members to sign off on any significant financial decision, so no one person could quietly move money around unchecked. We even set up a public online portal so any homeowner could check the budget or meeting minutes whenever they wanted. No formal written request needed. No stonewalling. No smirking dismissal. I still think about that fence fine sometimes. $500 and a single smirk. That's genuinely all it took to set this entire chain of events in motion. It's strange, looking back, how the people who abuse even small amounts of power rarely think anyone's actually watching closely enough, or patiently enough, to ever do something about it. Todd underestimated one homeowner with a folder full of paint receipts. That was his very first mistake. His last mistake was believing that rules are rules, only ever applied to everyone else on that street, never to him. Last I heard, Todd moved to a neighboring town after selling the house. Word around the neighborhood is he actually tried to join another HOA board out there not long after, and got laughed straight out of the room the moment someone pulled out their phone and Googled his name. If this story gave you that little jolt of satisfaction, go ahead and smash that like button, and let me know in the comments. What's the most satisfying case of real-life karma you've ever personally witnessed? And if you enjoyed this one, subscribe, because there are a lot more stories exactly like this one coming your way.